Smoke still clung to her skin, the scent of fire never fully leaving her no matter how many showers she took. Her hands were supposed to hold heavy hoses, carry ladders, and pull strangers from burning ruins. Yet tonight they trembled, not from flames, but from the way they had found themselves resting on someone who wasn't supposed to matter this much. She wasn't just another face saved from a blaze, she was the reason the firefighters' heart beat faster, the reason duty felt suddenly tangled with desire. What began as an act of courage inside a storm of smoke was quietly turning into something that neither water nor fire could ever put out. The night had been long, the kind that pressed heavy on the shoulders of those who carried responsibility. The station was quiet now, only the low hum of distant city life sneaking through the walls. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the bunk room, her boots resting on the floor, laces still dusted with gray ash from the fire earlier that evening. Her body ached, but it wasn't the ache of exhaustion that unsettled her most. It was the memory of her hands, the way they had betrayed her, not by failing to hold a hose or steady a ladder, but by finding warmth in a place she had never expected. She had pulled her from the smoke, arms strong, heart racing. At first, it was only instinct, save the woman, carry her out, feel the rush of air sting her lungs as they broke into safety together. But once she was down, coughing, gripping onto her arm for support, something in her shifted. Those hands, trained to rescue, lingered a second too long against soft skin. The firefighter told herself it was nothing, just a moment of adrenaline, but she knew better. Her fingers had memorized the way that touch felt, the way their closeness demanded more than duty allowed. She closed her eyes now, replaying it in the dark, the sound of crackling fire replaced by the sound of her shallow breaths beside her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Her life was about service, about strength, about not crossing lines that could blur the focus of her work. Yet here she was, heart beating faster at the thought of someone she barely knew, someone she was meant to protect and let go of, not hold on to. The city outside never slept, and neither did her thoughts. She remembered how the woman's hair smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, how her eyes, though teary from the haze, searched hers with something unspoken, something deeper than gratitude. That look haunted her more than any flame ever could. It was not the kind of look people gave to their rescuers, it was the kind of look that stripped walls down, the kind that whispered of a connection born in chaos but destined to ignite into something greater if allowed. She rubbed her palms together now, still feeling the phantom warmth of her touch, ashamed and exhilarated all at once. She had always known fire was dangerous, but she never realized the danger could come from within, that her own chest could burn hotter than any blaze she fought. It scared her, but it also woke her up in ways she couldn't explain. She thought about what tomorrow might bring, if fate would let their paths cross again outside the smoke and chaos. She thought about whether she had the courage to face a feeling she had buried for years, the truth of who she was, the truth her uniform and helmet could never protect her from. Tonight, she was not just a firefighter. Tonight, she was a woman whose hands remembered too much and whose heart had begun to write a story she didn't yet know how to tell. The morning light crept through the thin blinds of the station, soft and golden, but it did nothing to quiet the storm inside her. She had been awake long before dawn, lying still on the stiff mattress, replaying every second of the fire and the moments after. She could feel it in her chest, the way her heart had beat too fast, the way her breath caught when she realized she was still holding her long after the danger was over. She tried to shake it off, bury herself in routine, polish the boots, check the truck, roll the hoses, but even as her hands moved, her mind wandered back to the night before. Every task was supposed to be mechanical, practiced, drilled into her until muscle memory carried her without thought, but today nothing felt mechanical. It all felt heavier, like every action reminded her of what those hands had done, and what they wanted to do again. The others in the station noticed the quiet in her. They teased her for looking like she hadn't slept, but she laughed it off, muttered something about the fire being rougher than expected. None of them could guess the truth. None of them knew that it wasn't the smoke making her chest tight, it was the memory of someone's eyes in the middle of the chaos, eyes that had followed her into the night and stayed until morning. Later, when her shift ended, she walked home with the weight of her gear pulling against her back, but it was her thoughts that made her feel heavier than ever. She passed the cafe near the corner, the one where people lingered on slow mornings, sipping coffee as though the world wasn't rushing outside. She had never paid much attention to it before, too focused on schedules and sirens. But today, her feet slowed, her eyes scanning the windows almost without meaning to, searching for a face she wasn't even sure she'd see. She told herself it was silly, that she had no reason to expect her there, no reason to think fate would be so kind. Yet when she looked through the glass, there she was. Her heart stumbled inside her chest, beating in a rhythm so uneven she could barely breathe. She sat there, a book in her hands, hair still carrying the faintest hint of singe at the ends, a mark of the fire that had nearly taken her. But her face, it looked calmer, softer, framed by the morning light, and when she lifted her eyes, it felt like the air between them shifted. For a moment, she froze, the firefighter who had faced flames and collapsing roofs now paralyzed by the weight of a single glance. She almost turned away, almost convinced herself to keep walking, to pretend she hadn't seen her, to let this be nothing more than memory. But her body betrayed her again. Her feet carried her forward, the door chimed softly as she entered, and every step toward her felt like walking into something she wasn't ready for. The smell of roasted coffee beans filled her lungs, grounding her as much as it unmoored her. When she reached the table, she opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught before she could find the right words. She didn't need to introduce herself, the woman already knew who she was. Gratitude flickered in her eyes, but something else lingered too, something unspoken that made her palms sweat and her throat tighten. She slid into the chair across from her, the wooden seat creaking as though echoing her own nervousness. The conversation began with safe words, polite thanks, small gestures. But beneath every word lay a current, a silent pull drawing them closer, one that neither of them dared to name but both felt deeply. She watched the way her lips curved when she spoke, the way her hands brushed against the mud as if searching for warmth, and she realized she wasn't just looking at someone she had saved. She was looking at someone who had already begun to save her too, in a way she didn't yet understand. And as the minutes passed, she knew this was no accident. Something had started that night in the fire, and it was here now, burning quietly between them, waiting to spread. The coffee shop seemed to shrink around them, the hum of conversations fading into a blur, the clinking of cups against saucers muffled as if the world itself had decided to step back and leave the two of them suspended in their own fragile bubble. She found herself leaning forward, elbows on the table, listening more than speaking, her eyes unable to let go of the way her mouth formed every word. She had thought she came here to check in, to reassure herself that the woman she'd carried from the smoke was safe, but the truth unfolded quickly. It wasn't safety she wanted to confirm, it was connection. She wanted to know what made her laugh, what kept her awake at night, what pieces of her life burned brighter than any fire she had faced. She wanted to know everything, and that scared her more than she could admit. The firefighter's hands curled around the mug she had barely touched, knuckles tight, the ceramic warm against her skin, though no amount of heat from the cup matched the warmth building in her chest. She noticed the way the other woman's fingers brushed nervously at the pages of her book, how she turned the same corner over and over as if pretending to read when her attention was fully fixed on the conversation between them. There was an unspoken rhythm growing, a pulse they shared without naming it, one that filled the silence whenever their words faltered. She felt it in the air, the spark, the quiet recognition of two souls caught in something neither had been prepared for. And yet, neither of them wanted to walk away. Hours passed in what felt like minutes, the golden morning light slipping into the softer glow of afternoon. They spoke about the fire, though not in detail. She thanked her again, her voice trembling in a way that revealed gratitude mixed with something deeper. But then the conversation drifted into unexpected places, into stories of childhood, into dreams half forgotten, into the loneliness that sometimes sat in the corners of their lives. With each revelation, the firefighter's chest grew tighter, as though every truth spoken was stitching itself into her. She realized with startling clarity that she had never been this open with anyone, not even the people she'd known for years in the station. And it wasn't because she had chosen silence in the past, it was because no one had ever made her feel safe enough to speak. But here, with her, safety came without effort. She studied her smile, the way it lingered longer than it should have, the way it made her stomach twist in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. There were moments when their eyes locked and neither moved, neither spoke, because the silence carried more weight than words ever could. And it was in those pauses that her hands itched with the memory of the night before, the feel of her pressed close against her, fragile yet strong, trembling yet alive. She forced her fingers to stay still, to stay wrapped around her mug, but the longing buzzed through her veins like a secret she could barely contain. Eventually, the world reminded them of its presence, the barista clearing tables, the sunlight dipping lower, the sound of doors opening and closing as people moved on with their lives. But neither of them seemed ready to leave. When she finally glanced at her watch, surprised by how much time had passed, she hesitated. She didn't want to let this moment end. And in that hesitation, she saw the same reluctance mirrored in her companion's eyes, that soft pleading hidden beneath a polite smile, as if both of them were silently begging time to stop. Instead, she offered to walk her home, her voice quieter than usual, laced with a vulnerability she rarely showed. There was a flicker of hesitation before the woman nodded, gathering her things with trembling hands, as though she understood this was no longer about gratitude or politeness. This was something else, something fragile and dangerous, something worth stepping into even if neither of them could see where it would lead. As they stepped outside together, the cool air wrapped around them, and for the first time, the firefighter felt the weight of her helmet and gear fully gone. She wasn't walking as the savior tonight. She was walking as a woman, carrying a heart she could no longer keep hidden. The city's evening air wrapped around them as they walked side by side, the soft rhythm of their footsteps against the pavement filling the spaces where words hesitated. Streetlights flickered awake above, painting their shadows long and wavering, two figures drawn together though neither dared to admit how much the closeness mattered. She kept her hands tucked in her jacket pockets, as though hiding them might silence the restless memory of where they had lingered before, but the urge to reach across the narrow space between them pulsed stronger with every step. The other woman clutched her bag strapped tightly, as if anchoring herself against the current of something she too felt rising but wasn't ready to speak aloud. Their conversation came in bursts, small fragments about the day, casual observations about the neighborhood they passed, but beneath it all lived a quiet tension that no words could disguise. Every glance carried more weight than it should have, every brush of their shoulders sent sparks through the spaces that had been starved of touch for far too long. She caught herself studying her profile, the curve of her jaw softened by the glow of the street lamps, the way her lips parted slightly when she was about to say something but then chose silence instead. It was silence that felt less like emptiness and more like a promise, as though the night itself waited for one of them to be brave enough to step closer. When they reached the corner near her apartment, the air seemed to thicken. The world was still moving, cars passed, strangers hurried by, but for them, it slowed into something quieter, something that asked them to notice only each other. She gestured toward the building, a small smile tugging at her lips, and thanked her again for the walk, her voice soft, careful, as though gratitude was the safest shield she could hide behind. But the firefighter wasn't ready to turn away. She shifted her weight, lingering in the space between leaving and staying, her chest heavy with everything she wanted to say but couldn't. It wasn't about bravery here, she had been brave 1,000 times before inside burning buildings. This was different. This was vulnerability, and it demanded a kind of courage she had never been trained for. Their eyes met, and for a suspended moment neither looked away. It was in that gaze that the walls they both carried began to tremble. She felt the question hang unspoken in the air: what would happen if one of them stepped closer? Her body leaned forward almost instinctively, but she caught herself, pulling back before the distance closed. She feared ruining what had barely begun, feared crossing into something that might be too much too soon. Yet in that hesitation, she saw a flicker of something raw in the other woman's eyes, a longing she was trying hard to hide but couldn't fully mask. It was enough to make her heart pound louder than the city around them. The silence stretched until it became unbearable, and finally she cleared her throat, searching for words that wouldn't betray the storm inside her. But the words came out simpler than she expected, stripped of all the layers she tried to put on them. "I'm glad I saw you today," she said quietly, her voice lower than she intended, carrying more weight than the sentence should. And in response came a smile, small but trembling at the edges, the kind of smile that told her she wasn't alone in what she felt. It was all the answer she needed, though it wasn't enough to quiet the fire growing inside her. She forced herself to step back, to let the moment end before it burned them both. She said goodnight, turning slowly, each step away heavier than the last. But even as she walked, she felt her presence lingering like warmth against her skin, a warmth no distance could extinguish. And in that moment she realized this was no longer something she could ignore. The fire she feared most wasn't the kind she battled with water and strength. It was the one that had been lit quietly in her chest, fed by stolen glances and unspoken truths, a fire that was only just beginning to spread. The night after their walk home was endless. She lay awake in her apartment, staring at the ceiling where shadows shifted with the glow of passing headlights. Her body was still, but her mind was restless, consumed by the look in her eyes when they had lingered at the corner, the silent pull between them that had been louder than any siren she had ever heard. She tried to convince herself it was just gratitude, that the woman had simply been thankful to the one who had carried her out of danger. But she knew better. Gratitude didn't linger like that. Gratitude didn't make her hands ache to reach across the space between them. Gratitude didn't replay itself over and over in the middle of the night like an unfinished sentence. She found herself gripping the bedsheets, restless, wondering if the other woman was awake too, thinking about her, remembering that heavy silence at the end of the walk. It was a silence that said more than words ever could, one that begged for something to be admitted but left unsaid. The next day at the station, she was useless. Her colleagues noticed how distracted she seemed, teasing her again, joking that maybe she had finally met someone. She laughed them off with a shake of her head, but their words cut closer to the truth than they realized. She wanted to bury the thought, to shove it down beneath the armor she wore, the armor that had always kept her hidden from the truth of her own desires. Yet every time she tried, the memory of her eyes pulled her back, reminding her that something had shifted and no amount of denial would make it go away. She picked up her phone more times than she could count, staring at the blank screen, fighting the urge to reach out. What would she even say? How could she put into words what she didn't fully understand herself? Hours passed like this, every second stretching longer, until finally her phone buzzed. A message lit the screen, simple and unexpected. It was her. Just a few words: "I hope your day is easier than yesterday." She read it over and over, her heart racing at the idea that she had been thought of, remembered, maybe even missed. Her hands trembled as she typed a response, erasing and rewriting until finally she sent something back that felt safe, though her feelings screamed louder than her words. "It's better now. How's yours?" The exchange continued through the afternoon, slow at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. They spoke about small things, the taste of her morning coffee, the sound of sirens outside the window, the comfort of music that filled quiet rooms, but beneath the small talk lived something deeper. Every reply carried warmth, every pause between messages filled with the weight of anticipation. She found herself smiling at her phone, laughing at her words, feeling lighter than she had in years. And yet, mixed with that joy was fear. Fear of where this was leading. Fear of what it meant to feel this deeply for someone she had only just begun to know. Fear that once spoken, the truth could not be taken back. But the fear didn't stop her from answering, didn't stop her from waiting for the next message, didn't stop her from longing. By evening, the conversation had grown bolder. There were questions that tiptoed toward vulnerability, admissions that cracked the surface of their guarded hearts. She confessed how lonely the nights at the station could be, how the quiet after a fire was sometimes louder than the blaze itself. The other woman admitted how close she had come to giving up inside that burning building, how she thought no one would reach her in time, and how seeing her face in the smoke felt like life itself had chosen her for another chance. Reading those words made her chest ache, her eyes sting. She wanted to be strong, steady, the rescuer who never faltered, but she could not deny how much it meant to hear that she was more than a savior, she was someone who had changed the course of another person's life. As night fell again, their words slowed, but neither of them wanted to say goodbye. Each goodnight dragged out, delayed by more questions, more little fragments of truth, until finally she stared at the last message on her screen, her heart heavy and full all at once. She turned off the light, lying in the dark with the glow of her phone still imprinted in her vision, and she knew something was happening that she could no longer resist. It wasn't just longing anymore. It wasn't just a spark. It was a fire building, steady and strong, a fire that asked her to step closer, to stop hiding from the truth she had buried for so long. And though she tried to quiet her racing thoughts, she couldn't shake the image of what it would feel like to finally let her hands wander again, not out of accident, not out of adrenaline, but out of a choice she was no longer afraid to make. The week moved slowly, each day dragging as though time itself was testing her patience. She went through her duties at the station with the same precision as always, checking equipment, running drills, responding to calls, but her focus was never fully there. It drifted constantly, pulled back to the glow of her phone and the words waiting for her when she finally allowed herself a quiet moment to look. Their messages had grown longer, stretching into late hours of the night, both of them reluctant to let the conversation end. What had started as casual exchanges now carried weight, their words leaning into honesty neither of them had given anyone else before. They spoke about loneliness, about the way silence could feel heavy enough to crush, about moments in their past that had shaped them into who they were. And though the firefighter had always been guarded, always careful with what she revealed, she found herself opening up in ways that startled her. She admitted how she had built walls around herself for years, how she had thrown herself into her work because it was easier than facing questions about her heart. She confessed how she had hidden behind duty, how even in the laughter of her colleagues and the thrill of saving lives, there was still a space inside her that felt empty. She expected hesitation in response, maybe distance, but instead came warmth, words that wrapped around her like comfort. She read confessions about fear, about the fragility of life, about how that night in the fire had been both the most terrifying and the most awakening moment of her life. And then came the words that lingered longest, "I feel like I was meant to meet you." She read that line again and again, her breath shallow, her chest tight, because it echoed the truth she had been too afraid to admit. She couldn't pretend anymore that this was just gratitude, that this was just kindness shared between two people who had collided by accident. It was something more, and it was pulling her in deeper every day. When she finally suggested meeting again, the reply came quickly, almost too quickly, as if the waiting had been just as unbearable on the other side. They chose a quiet evening, a cafe tucked away on a side street, one that wasn't too crowded, where the world might let them exist without interruption. She arrived early, her nerves restless, her palms sweating despite the cool evening breeze. She sat at a corner table, heart pounding with every minute that passed, until she walked in. The sight of her was enough to make the air in the room shift. She carried herself with a kind of tentative grace, like someone both nervous and hopeful, and when their eyes met across the room, everything else blurred. She slid into the seat across from her, and for a while, they stayed with safe topics again, work, books, little details about their days, but the undercurrent was stronger now, harder to ignore. Every time their hands brushed against the table, every time their eyes lingered too long, the space between them shrank. The silence between words wasn't awkward anymore, it was charged, alive, full of questions neither dared to speak but both desperately wanted answered. At one point, her hand shifted slightly closer, resting flat against the table, fingers twitching as though debating whether to move farther. And when the other woman's hand moved just an inch, just enough for their fingers to almost touch, her breath caught. That small distance felt heavier than the weight of her gear, heavier than any fire she had faced, because it carried a risk she had never let herself take before. They didn't touch, not yet. But the nearness was enough to burn. The night grew darker outside, and the cafe grew quieter, until finally they were two of the last left. Neither wanted to leave, but eventually they stood, lingering near the door as if both were waiting for the other to be brave first. The air between them was thick, every glance loaded with the truth they had been holding back. She wanted to reach out, to let her hand close the space, but she hesitated, fear holding her back from crossing that fragile line. And then, as they stepped outside, the other woman's hand brushed hers, fleeting, accidental, or maybe not. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to set her heart racing, enough to make her wonder if the line had already been crossed in ways words had yet to catch up to. She walked her home again, their steps slower this time, dragging out the night as much as possible. When they reached the corner near her apartment, they stood together under the dim glow of the street lamp, silence pressing around them. Their eyes met, steady and unflinching, and she knew they were both asking the same question without speaking it aloud. She wanted to lean in, to let her hands do what they had wanted from the start, but she held back, teeth pressed against her lip, afraid of rushing something that felt too important to break. Instead, she whispered a good night, her voice softer than the wind, and turned before she could change her mind. But as she walked away, the memory of that almost touch burned hotter than any flame she had ever battled, and she knew the next time would not end in silence. The fire was growing too strong to keep hidden. The days that followed were heavy with anticipation, every hour stretched thin with the weight of what had almost happened. She went through her shifts at the station like a woman split in two, on the outside, steady and dependable, answering alarms, carrying out her duties without flaw, but inside she was restless, haunted by the feel of fingertips brushing hers and the silence that had nearly broken open that night. Each time the siren screamed, she ran into danger without hesitation, but in the quiet that followed, when she was alone with her thoughts, she felt less brave. The fear of stepping forward into the truth of her heart was somehow greater than any flame she had faced, and yet the desire to stop running from herself grew stronger every day. Their messages did not slow. If anything, they became heavier, layered with meaning that hovered between words. Each sentence carried a tenderness that could no longer be disguised as casual conversation. She found herself smiling without reason when her phone lit up, caught herself reading the same message 3 or 4 times just to relive the way it made her feel. And then one evening came when the words on the screen said something neither of them had dared to say directly before. "I keep thinking about the way it felt when you held me." She stared at that message for what felt like an eternity, her pulse thundering in her ears, her throat dry, her hands trembling. She typed, erased, typed again, afraid of saying too much or too little, until finally she let go and sent the truth. "I keep thinking about it too." The silence that followed was unbearable, each minute a sharp edge cutting at her nerves, but then came the reply, "Maybe we should stop thinking and just see each other." The decision was made without hesitation. They chose to meet at her apartment this time, a quieter place where the world couldn't interrupt. When the knock finally came at her door, her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and longing so intense it nearly stole her breath. She opened it to find her standing there, a faint nervousness in her smile, eyes wide and searching, and in that instant the air between them shifted again, heavier and more fragile than ever. Inside, the space felt too small to contain the electricity building between them. They sat on the couch at first, pretending at normalcy, their voices carrying conversation about safe things, work, neighbors, the book she had been reading, but neither of them could ignore the truth humming beneath every word. The distance between them grew unbearable, and when silence finally fell, it wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, demanding. She found her hand resting on her knee, fingers twitching, aching to move. She looked at her, really looked, and saw the same battle playing out in her eyes, the desire, the hesitation, the fear of breaking something fragile but the stronger fear of never knowing what might have been. Their eyes locked, neither willing to look away, and the weight of everything unsaid pressed harder until it could no longer be contained. Slowly, almost timidly, her hand moved, bridging the small space between them until her fingers brushed lightly against hers. The touch was soft, hesitant, a question without words, but the answer came when her hand did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled back, meeting hers, holding on with a grip that was both trembling and sure. The silence broke not with words but with the sound of their breathing, shallow and uneven, the sound of hearts finally allowed to admit what they wanted. Her thumb brushed against the back of her hand, and it felt like fire and relief all at once, a touch that carried every unspoken thought they had buried for days. She shifted closer, the air between them shrinking, and still neither spoke. Words weren't needed now. The closeness said it all. Their shoulders touched, and then their knees, and finally the space that had once been filled with hesitation collapsed into something undeniable. When she lifted her hand to her face, brushing a strand of hair gently behind her ear, the firefighter felt the world tilt. Those hands, meant for strength and rescue, were tender now, lingering against her cheek as though afraid she might disappear. Her breath hitched, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, the moment swallowed them whole, and when she finally leaned in, when the distance was erased completely, it was not the rush of flames she felt but the slow, consuming warmth of something real, something long denied but finally alive. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, like testing a flame to see if it would burn, but when neither pulled away, it deepened, carrying the weight of every look, every silence, every brush of fingers that had led to this moment. It was fragile and fierce all at once, and when they finally pulled back, foreheads resting together, both of them breathless, there was no longer any question of what they were to each other. They had stepped across the line, and there was no going back. The days that followed were heavy with anticipation, every hour stretched thin with the weight of what had almost happened. She went through her shifts at the station like a woman split in two, on the outside, steady and dependable, answering alarms, carrying out her duties without flaw, but inside she was restless, haunted by the feel of fingertips brushing hers and the silence that had nearly broken open that night. Each time the siren screamed, she ran into danger without hesitation, but in the quiet that followed, when she was alone with her thoughts, she felt less brave. The fear of stepping forward into the truth of her heart was somehow greater than any flame she had faced, and yet the desire to stop running from herself grew stronger every day. Their messages did not slow. If anything, they became heavier, layered with meaning that hovered between words. Each sentence carried a tenderness that could no longer be disguised as casual conversation. She found herself smiling without reason when her phone lit up, caught herself reading the same message 3 or 4 times just to relive the way it made her feel. And then one evening came when the words on the screen said something neither of them had dared to say directly before. "I keep thinking about the way it felt when you held me." She stared at that message for what felt like an eternity, her pulse thundering in her ears, her throat dry, her hands trembling. She typed, erased, typed again, afraid of saying too much or too little, until finally she let go and sent the truth. "I keep thinking about it too." The silence that followed was unbearable, each minute a sharp edge cutting at her nerves, but then came the reply, "Maybe we should stop thinking and just see each other." The decision was made without hesitation. They chose to meet at her apartment this time, a quieter place where the world couldn't interrupt. When the knock finally came at her door, her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and longing so intense it nearly stole her breath. She opened it to find her standing there, a faint nervousness in her smile, eyes wide and searching, and in that instant the air between them shifted again, heavier and more fragile than ever. Inside, the space felt too small to contain the electricity building between them. They sat on the couch at first, pretending at normalcy, their voices carrying conversation about safe things, work, neighbors, the book she had been reading, but neither of them could ignore the truth humming beneath every word. The distance between them grew unbearable, and when silence finally fell, it wasn't empty. It was thick, charged, demanding. She found her hand resting on her knee, fingers twitching, aching to move. She looked at her, really looked, and saw the same battle playing out in her eyes, the desire, the hesitation, the fear of breaking something fragile but the stronger fear of never knowing what might have been. Their eyes locked, neither willing to look away, and the weight of everything unsaid pressed harder until it could no longer be contained. Slowly, almost timidly, her hand moved, bridging the small space between them until her fingers brushed lightly against hers. The touch was soft, hesitant, a question without words, but the answer came when her hand did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled back, meeting hers, holding on with a grip that was both trembling and sure. The silence broke not with words but with the sound of their breathing, shallow and uneven, the sound of hearts finally allowed to admit what they wanted. Her thumb brushed against the back of her hand, and it felt like fire and relief all at once, a touch that carried every unspoken thought they had buried for days. She shifted closer, the air between them shrinking, and still neither spoke. Words weren't needed now. The closeness said it all. Their shoulders touched, and then their knees, and finally the space that had once been filled with hesitation collapsed into something undeniable. When she lifted her hand to her face, brushing a strand of hair gently behind her ear, the firefighter felt the world tilt. Those hands, meant for strength and rescue, were tender now, lingering against her cheek as though afraid she might disappear. Her breath hitched, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, the moment swallowed them whole, and when she finally leaned in, when the distance was erased completely, it was not the rush of flames she felt but the slow, consuming warmth of something real, something long denied but finally alive. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, like testing a flame to see if it would burn, but when neither pulled away, it deepened, carrying the weight of every look, every silence, every brush of fingers that had led to this moment. It was fragile and fierce all at once, and when they finally pulled back, foreheads resting together, both of them breathless, there was no longer any question of what they were to each other. They had stepped across the line, and there was no going back. The hours that followed blurred into something timeless, as if the night had chosen to suspend itself for them alone. The first kiss had been hesitant, trembling with the weight of all their unspoken fears, but what came after unfolded with a gentleness that neither of them had ever known. They stayed on the couch for what felt like forever, hands tangled together, speaking in whispers that had less to do with words and more to do with the comfort of hearing one another's breath. Every small touch carried the intensity of years of silence finally breaking. Her hand rested lightly against her cheek, tracing the soft curve as though trying to memorize the moment, while the other woman's fingers brushed against her wrist, feeling the steady pulse that betrayed how alive she suddenly felt. They didn't rush. There was no urgency in their closeness, only the slow unraveling of walls that had been built so high it seemed impossible to imagine them ever falling. Yet in this quiet, those walls crumbled with ease, not from force but from the simple truth of being seen. She confessed things she had never said aloud before, how long she had hidden from herself, how often she had buried her feelings under duty and responsibility, how much she had feared that love, real love, wasn't something meant for her. Saying it out loud felt terrifying, but when she looked into her eyes, she found no judgment, only warmth, only the reflection of her own vulnerability staring back. The other woman admitted her own fears too, her voice trembling as she spoke about the loneliness that had haunted her nights, about the way she had convinced herself not to hope for more, not to expect anyone to stay. She admitted how the fire had terrified her, but how seeing her appear through the smoke had felt like a second chance she didn't think she deserved. They listened to each other with an intensity that silenced the world outside, the connection deepening with every truth shared. It was not dramatic, not rushed, but steady and certain, like a fire that no water could ever put out. Their laughter came softly between confessions, little pieces of joy that felt foreign but healing. She noticed how the other woman's face lit up when she laughed, how the sound itself eased the weight in her chest. And when the silences came, they no longer carried tension. They were full, content, heavy with the comfort of knowing that neither of them needed to fill the space with anything but presence. Eventually, the couch felt too small to contain what they were feeling, and they moved to the floor, leaning against each other, sharing stories like teenagers caught in the giddy haze of first love. She let her head rest on her shoulder, and for the first time in years, she felt safe enough to close her eyes, not out of exhaustion but out of peace. Hours slipped by, the night deepened, and still neither moved to end it. They knew that when the sun rose, the world outside would demand things from them again, duty, strength, the masks they had worn for so long, but in that room, in that night, they allowed themselves to simply be two women who had finally stopped running from their hearts. When sleep began to creep in, heavy and soft, they didn't fight it. She felt her hand tighten around hers one last time, as though making a silent promise not to let go, and she answered with the same grip, strong and steady. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was the quiet smile on her lips, and the last thing she felt was the warmth of someone who finally made her believe she didn't have to carry her life alone. Morning light eventually broke through the curtains, pale and tender, spilling across their faces as they stirred awake. For a brief moment, she panicked, unsure if the night had been a dream, but then she felt the weight of her hand still in hers, the warmth of her body still close, and the fear dissolved into something unshakable. They exchanged sleepy smiles, soft words that carried the weight of all that had been admitted in the dark, and in that moment she understood that this wasn't fleeting. This wasn't born only from gratitude or accident. This was real. This was the kind of fire that changed everything, not by destroying but by remaking, by clearing the ashes and leaving room for something stronger to grow. She knew challenges would come, the world didn't always accept what it couldn't understand, and their lives would not suddenly become easy, but she no longer felt afraid of that truth. For the first time, she felt ready to face it, because she wouldn't be facing it alone. As they rose together, hand in hand, the firefighter understood that her hands had found their true purpose. They were not only meant to hold hoses or to pull strangers from the flames. They were meant to hold her, to protect her, to steady her in a world that had tried to convince them both that love like this was too dangerous to exist. And as they stepped into the new day, hearts bound together, she realized that sometimes the greatest battles weren't fought in fire, but in the courage it took to let yourself be seen, to let yourself be loved, and to finally, after so long, choose to stay.